Tonight about development and Cambridge's contribution to it, and I'm going to take a historical approach, which is the foundation of my approach to these questions. Kate seemed to imagine that because I have a scurrilous disposition that I would use the opportunity to rubbish Cambridge, which I will to a certain extent. But what interests me far more about Cambridge is the potential for renewal and expansion and for innovation that has characterized its development for 800 years, and I want to talk about that. So my talk is in three parts. The first is on development, which I will argue that I have 5 different takes on what development might mean in this context, each one of them referring to a different historical period, but all of them relevant to us today. Then I'll talk about Cambridge, and finally I'll try and bring these two things together in the third section, which will be briefer, to talk about what Cambridge might contribute to international development now. Now, for me, the first and dominant meaning of development, and certainly in the context of international development, is that it was the word that arose after the collapse of European empire, after the Second World War, after the anti-colonial revolution, which in my view is and was the most significant political movement of the 20th century. It was the word that arose to describe a post-colonial relationship between rich and poor countries. So for me, development refers to a particular period in which there was the premise of rich countries helping poor countries to become richer in the aftermath of colonial empire. And I believe that this premise was seriously undertaken in what the French call les 30 glorieuses, the 3 decades from 1945 to 1975, in which not only in the West did industrial societies commit themselves to an expansion of public services, a version, if you like, of social democracy, but also they were committed to the idea of the developmental state. In fact, until the early 70s, it was universally acknowledged that the only institution capable of lifting an economy systematically and effectively was the state. And this idea of a developmental state, which was universal, whether you were a Marxist or a Keynesian, began to unravel in the 1970s, and of course was replaced by a market fundamentalism, which, as we know, held sway for 3 decades after that, from the 80s. Now, so my argument would be, first of all, that the premise, the political premise of development was based on an experience of sustained economic growth at the global level, which in turn was fueled by the leading industrial countries committing themselves to expanded public expenditure in a coordinated way, which lifted the world market for an unprecedented period in the 50s and 60s. And it seemed quite reasonable in this period that poor countries could aspire to raising themselves economically with the aid of countries which had something to spare. And of course this unraveled in the, as I've said, in the 1970s for a number of reasons, and was replaced by something which still called itself development, but was not in any serious way committed to it. I mean, from the 80s onwards, what became known as the Washington Consensus was essentially committed to reducing the power of states to influence their citizens' economic conditions, and instead letting the market hold sway in a relatively unfettered way. This was also a period when the wild banking boom of the 1970s, that was fueled by the oil surplus created by the formation of OPEC in the energy crisis of 1973, this led to a vast amount of bad debt in the poor countries, which meant that in the period, in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the poor countries contributed more directly in real terms to the rich countries. The flow of income, if you like, from the poor to the rich was greater than at any other time in history. In other words, the period of the 80s and 90s, and going on into the first decade of this century, was saw a systematic income drain of unparalleled proportions. The idea of development in its original sense went out of the window under these circumstances. And development, it became a kind of talk without any real consequences, I would argue. Okay, so that's the first notion of development. The second one is what's been happening in the last 200 years, since the time of the Industrial Revolution, about around 1800. Around 1800, the world population was about 1 billion. And in the following 2 centuries, it became, as it is now, more than 6 billion. The proportion of human beings living in cities was something like 1 in 40, or 2.5%, around 1800. And it's now almost a half. And finally, for at least 150 years, now what these two, and let me give an annual, what this means is that population has been growing for 200 years at an average rate of 1.5%. And urbanization has been taking place at a rate of 2%. And the difference between population growth and the rate of urbanization, 0.5%, is what has created this massive growth of cities. But the rate of energy production and consumption has been growing at 3%, or twice the rate of population growth for at least 150 years. But of course, this additional energy is wildly unevenly distributed. I mean, American citizens consume 200 times the energy of Ugandan citizens. This is, of course, widely known. But what I want to draw attention to is what this phenomenon, which is truly incredible, what drove it? Well, we all know what drove it. What drove it was capitalism. So the second pair of ways in which development has been used in the last 200 years by original thinkers and so on, is that on the one hand, it's an answer to the question, how did they do it? How do you make such an incredible economic expansion? What is the source of this economic growth? How can we get on the bandwagon? So that's development in that sense. How does capitalism pull it off? But the other notion of development is based on the notion that capitalism is both creative and highly destructive. And so one of the consequences of capitalist development is a large amount of social pathology. This was clear to writers like Saint-Simon from soon after the French Revolution. And so the second meaning of development in this context is, how can we patch up the mess that capitalism makes.